Whether you're about to begin your first novel or you've already finished the first draft, it's likely that your villain makes some of these classic beginner mistakes. If you create a villain that is extremely powerful and ruthless and motivated, all things that make a strong villain, he could still end up disappointing your audience if you also make any of these crucial character building mistakes. Assigning strong character traits to your villain, or any of your characters, is easier than noticing weak character traits that you might have unintentionally given to them. But you need to notice those traits if you want to create a villain that haunts your reader and lasts in their mind long after the story is finished. So basically, you can't just give your villain the characteristics of a strong villain and expect it to overcome any characteristics of a weak villain that he might also have. So let's take a look at 7 mistakes that writers make when creating their villain that you might not notice are weakening your villain's character. Mistake number 1. You don't develop a connection between your villain and your protagonist. Now, this does not mean that they should be a secret family. Don't do that. Well, I mean, you can do that, but we'll all see it coming. It's overdone. Don't do it. No, this means that your hero and your villain should be connected in some sort of literary sense. Perhaps they're foils, so their opposite traits play off one another, or maybe they have opposing views on some vital aspect of their world. The hero believes magic should be open to everybody, while the villain believes that only a select few should have access to magic. Then it would make sense as to why they are enemies. Maybe they have similar beliefs about what should happen in the world, but opposing beliefs about how it should happen. Should we nuke New York in order to stop the spread of disease? Or do we value the innocent lives in New York and want to find a way to destroy only the disease? The hero and the villain need to be fundamentally connected, either in belief or power or agenda. If there is no connection between the hero and the villain, then it will always feel like they're fighting just because. Because you're the writer and you decided that they needed to hate each other. Or because one is the villain and one is the hero, so they just have to fight. That's just the way it is. But when you were a child, didn't you hate it when your parents would end an argument by saying, "Because I said so"? Well, that is because it is a weak argument, and even as a child, you knew that. It doesn't matter how grotesque and evil and, terrible to look upon, you make your villain. If there is no connection to the hero, then your audience will always be like, what's the point? Mistake number 2. You're writing a villain that is not unique. This is a strange problem that I rarely see affecting a story's protagonist, but for some reason, the antagonist often feels stolen from some other person's story and then just plunked down into yours. Why? I'm not sure what phenomenon causes this, but I have to imagine that it has something to do with the incredibly strong stereotype that we have in our heads of what a villain is. So you're writing a story and you're like, okay, this is the villain, therefore he is power hungry and ruthless and wealthy. Villain. That's just every villain we've ever heard of. They are not unique at all. Maybe it would help if you didn't think of your villain as the villain, but instead created him as a complete character on his own that also acts as the primary obstacle in your story. Would that help? I don't know. But we've got to try something, because we're just churning out villains from the villain factory, and they are literally all the same man. Mistake number 3. You create a powerful villain that has absolutely no effect on the rest of the world. Once the villain is beaten, good reigns again, and there's no lasting villainy impacting the world. All is well. This is an especially important mistake to consider when you're writing a series, but it also still has implications for standalone stories. Worlds, communities, lives are changed by the presence of evil, even when that evil is temporary or vanquished at the end of the story. The world shouldn't be the same world as it was at the beginning of the story. Maybe physically the world is different or damaged now. Maybe, depending on how long the villain was in power, there are a large number of civilians that still believe that the villain was right, and the world has to figure out how to move forward with all those people still believing that. What kind of ruckus are they causing? Maybe the characters in the story have to consider how the structures of their world need to change in order to prevent a similar villain from re-emerging in some point in the future. They need to recognize that some aspect of the previous world made it possible for this villain to emerge. What aspect was that, and how can we change it to prevent a similar villain from emerging? Or maybe the characters in the world just have to recognize that their faith in the world's structures has been shaken, and now they are less trusting of each other, or of their community. Maybe they're more individualistic now, since for a while they've been forced to look out for only themselves, knowing that nobody in the community is going to come save them from this villain that reigned over them for some period of time. You know, just some change, some consequence of having evil succeed in the world for any length of time. Mistake number 4. You are not utilizing your villain's introduction. The introduction of your villain is probably more important than the introduction of your hero. The entire tone of your story will be based off of this introduction of your. You can either hook your readers or lose them with the introduction of the villain. They might be more forgiving with the introduction of the hero. But when they see the villain, they're going to be thinking, is this a new, original villain? Or repetitive mustache twirler that they've seen a bunch of times before? Does the villain seem like a good match for the hero? Or can the audience already imagine how the hero will defeat the villain, so they just check out for the rest of the story? If you waste the villain's introduction, you're going to be spending the rest of the story trying to convince your audience to stick around, rather than already having them by the throat, which is what a good villain introduction will do. A clean, classic way to prevent this problem is to craft a villain introduction that looks something like this. First, you show your hero battling some mythic beast, or in the case of a series, you show them battling a previous villain, and the hero is struggling to defeat them, maybe even failing to defeat them, and the mythic beast goes on to destroy people, or whatever it is that mythic beasts do. Then, you see the villain of this story encounter the same beast, or the same villain from the previous book, and he wipes him out instantly. No struggle. Then, your audience is like, whoa, this guy, he's a threat. How is the hero ever going to beat him? And then you're hooked and you need to keep reading in order to find out. I don't know if that's like the most original way to introduce a villain, but it's better than a weak introduction. This leads me to mistake number 4. You have a villain that is unnaturally patient when enacting their villainy. Villainy. I keep saying villainy, but I don't think that's right. I think it's villainy. I don't know. Anywho, let's call it the Voldemort effect. It's a good thing he always waited until the end of the school year to attack Harry. We wouldn't want him to fall behind on his studies now, would we? If your villain waits to the very end of the book to enact their evil plan, then you have to think, why? You don't know, we don't know, who cares? But my friend, that makes no sense. Why? There has to be some reason that the final battle isn't happening right now. You know, the build-up can't be just because that's the way a story works. Because is never a good answer. If we are introduced to the villain during a confrontation with the hero, why does the villain let the hero escape? Especially if the hero is already established as powerful in the world, and the villain will know that the hero is going to be some sort of threat to their plan in the future. The villain should have no reason to let them leave on their own accord. But this happens all the time. You write yourself into a corner, where the protagonist runs into the villain halfway through the story, or even at the beginning of the story when they're introducing the villain, and then you don't know how to get your hero out of it, so for some reason, the villain just hesitates in taking the hero out. Either by monologuing, or gloating, or musing about how similar the villain is to the hero, or by suggesting that the villain and the hero join sides to become the ultimate power team. And then the villain talks for so long that some outside force thwarts them. It can't be the hero yet, or else there'd be no tension for the rest of the story, and the audience would already know that the hero is stronger than the villain. But at the same time, the villain can't enact their evil plan yet, or else the hero would be dead. And most writers don't want that, so they have to let the hero live long enough that some outside force can swoop in and save them. And then they can spend the rest of the book building up their skills in order to defeat the villain. Why do we see that so often? But we do. We really, really do. It makes no sense. But all the time, even in like big Hollywood blockbusters, we see that same series of events play out. The villain has the hero in his grasp. That was a sword, but you couldn't tell. But we're only 30 pages into the book, so the villain can't win yet. So instead, for some unexplained reason, the villain has to leave the hero alive. You just can't do that. It feels forced. Like we can see your hand moving the players around the story. It doesn't feel natural. Why does the villain let the hero live now while only planning to kill them in the future? And why does the hero let the villain go now if they're already strong enough to beat them? You know, those are the two sides of the coin that you're working with. Either the villain is strong enough to kill the hero and for some reason doesn't, or the hero is strong enough to defeat the villain and for some reason doesn't. It just doesn't make sense. So, if you do decide to include that scene in your story, you have to either craft the explanations for the questions into the scene, or you need to find some way to introduce your villain that does not involve a direct confrontation between the villain and the hero. Just saying. Mistake number 6. Your villain is not human enough. Emotionally. Like, they could be some giant fish or something, fish man, but as long as they're sentient and not like an actual fish, they have to be believable as a human-like thing, with complex emotions and backstory and motivation. A life before villainy. They can't just be a mustache-twirling, cartoon villain, evil for the sake of evil type of person. That just won't fly, you know? Even in like a 20-minute episode of Scooby-Doo, when they unmask the monster, it's always some dude who has a reason for doing his evil deeds. Usually trying to keep people off his land or something, or lower the property values in the area. A believable person doing strange but acceptable villainy in order to achieve their goals. Which brings me to mistake number 7. Your villain has no or unclear motive. Your villain either has no motive or an unclear motive. A lot of the time, the villain's motive will either never be discussed, or it will feel like some sort of add-on. Like, oh, you know, just the typical stuff. Money, power, world domination, that kind of thing. Yada yada. That will never make a villain memorable. Because that is every villain we have ever seen. The audience needs to understand why the villain is doing what they're doing. And why the hero has to be the one to stop them. And not some other random, strong, powerful person. Or like the army or something. You know? It has to be specific. Why is the villain doing this evil thing? And why is the hero the only one that can stop them? Even in classic stories of good versus evil, the villain isn't evil for the sake of being evil. Like in The Dark Knight, the Joker isn't enacting chaos for the sake of chaos, but he's actually trying to prove to Batman and to the audience that the truth of humanity is chaos, and not the good that we pretend it is. Pretend it to be. Voldemort doesn't want to kill a 6th grader just because he's evil. But for reasons that we don't even need to understand, he was unable to destroy Harry years earlier. And now it is a matter of pride, of finishing what was started, of saving face. Even if he has no other reason for wanting to kill Harry, we still understand that, you know, as a motive for evil. That's a believable motive that can and does carry a story. And then as the series progresses, more nuanced motives can be explored. If you would like to see more mistakes that new writers make, click here. Or if you want to watch my favorite video that I have ever made, click here.